Welcome to the Derek Loudermilk Show. This is episode 309 with Francis Tapon. Today's guest, Francis Tapon, is an adventurer extraordinaire. He's been to every country in Africa, also every country in Eastern Europe. We spend a lot more time talking about his multi-year trip through Africa today, including how the laws are, how easy is it to get visas, what kind of vehicle you need to drive all over Africa. He also summited all the highest peaks in Africa, and there's this great story he tells about losing his wife's brother out in the desert on this mountain, which is totally wild. He ended up meeting and marrying an African while he was traveling, and now they both live back in the United States. So we talk a little bit about what that's like, how their relationship has progressed. And what's really cool is that he's a Harvard-trained MBA, and he set about trying to discover what ideas, both culturally and in business, that we could learn from these different areas of the world. So this is actually what I set out to do when I went to Southeast Asia. I was hoping to learn about how their approach to entrepreneurship could be applied to how we do business in the US. And he was thinking something very similar. So he's looking for lessons all along the way in all of these countries he's been to. So I think you're going to really, really like Francis Tapon and really enjoy his stories. So without further ado, here is Francis. Francis Tapon, welcome to the podcast.
Nice to meet you, Derek. Good to see you here. Honored to be here. I've even worn my nice flashy jacket.
Okay, yeah. Is that a high tech like insulation reflective thing, or what is it, a disco jacket?
Yeah, it's just a disco jacket. No special properties. It's not bulletproof.
I would wear something similar. I love to be flashy.
It's festive, very festive.
So you're quite the traveler, and maybe let's start with. How did you become to be a traveler? Okay, but first let me give your credentials. You've been up and down on the Continental Divide Trail. You've hiked the PCT and the AT. You've been through all the countries in Eastern Europe, through all the countries in Africa, more than 100 countries in the world, lots and lots of travel experience. But how did you become a traveler?
I think it started with my genetics. In other words, my mom is from Chile, my father's French. So right there, I kind of was, if I wanted to ever see any extended family members, I would have to get onto a plane at an early age and fly somewhere. So that's part of it. I think also the fact that my father was a bit of a traveler. He had an import-export business that took things from Latin America. So that could have been an influence. And I guess one of the catalysts, I suppose, although my family, we did do trips, and certainly international trips to see the family. I never had, by the way, both sides of my family on one dinner table ever. So I never had the French side and the Chilean side all sitting down like for one Thanksgiving or whatever you want to call it. It was always either the French side, but mostly the Chilean side. I would say I knew them like 90% better. 90% more time I spent with the Chilean family. And that's it. And so, but I think my first catalyst was when after I graduated from college, I took the seminal normal trip that you go off to Western Europe and you explore all of Western Europe. I spent about 90 days with my best friend, and he and I just explored there. So I think that was maybe the very first time I kind of like wanted to become a traveler. Mm-hmm. But it kind of went into the recesses of my mind. And I wanted to work internationally. That was another thing. I worked in Latin America. So that was another aspect. So I guess building here and there. I'm not sure if I could point to one moment when it happened, but I definitely think my international background probably was a big reason too.
Okay. I guess I was thinking of, I watched some of your TED Talks, and you talk about deciding to, I guess the first trail was the Pacific Crest Trail. Is that right?
Appalachian Trail. The Appalachian Trail.
Okay. And so what was the decision point that led you to go and do that?
Well, I had just finished I had started a company in Silicon Valley, a machine vision, robotic vision company with two other engineers. And the company didn't end ideally. It didn't finish in the way I wanted. I eventually sold my interest for peanuts. And I wasn't sure what to do next. And so when I advise anybody who's watching or listening to this is that if you're at an inflection point in your life where you're like, I'm not sure what to do next, it's a wonderful time to go out into the woods or to travel to some place that's out of your comfort zone. because what that will do is that it will kind of fire off neurons in your brain that have not been fired, that have been laying dormant for a long time. And it will force you to think out of the box and then maybe consider different aspects of your life. And so for that reason, I would suggest to people, when you're at that point, if you can afford it, it doesn't cost that much money, to take some time off, at least a week, ideally a couple of months, to like get away from it all and then recalibrate your life. And that's exactly what I did. That's why I went on the Appalachian Trail. At that point, I had discovered backpacking at the age of around 30. And I said, you know what? I really like to do backpacking. What's a long trail, like a really long trail? And yeah, Appalachian Trail is 2,200 miles almost. So that's a long trail.
Yeah. What did you get from your time in the wilderness that time?
So here's a shameless plug. The book that I wrote, which is called Hike Your Own Hike, 7 Life Lessons from Backpacking Across America. That is actually all the 7 lessons that I learned from that experience hiking the Appalachian Trail. So there's many things I could say about that, but succinctly, I think that you start to realize how you want to use your limited time here on this planet, and to value and to go after those things that really are important to you.
And then what was the direction? Sort of, you went into the wilderness to find some insight, and then you said, okay, I want to use this time wisely. Then what direction did you start going?
So I realized that if I had $1 billion, I would probably be spending a lot of time in the wilderness. I would spend a lot of time hiking. I would spend a lot of time traveling, going to international exotic locations and doing that kind of stuff. So I said, okay, how can I make this happen now? Because I might get cancer and die at 40. So how could I do this now? And so the best way to do it now, I thought, was to work for a couple of years, live like a monk, and then go off and do these things. So that was my strategy. Live like a monk, and then have that savings, what I call fuck you money, to fuck off and go do anything you want. Can you swear in this show?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
By all means. That must be important to you, because I think you asked me that when we were originally talking. You're like, I really want to be able to swear.
That's right. Well, I have a potty mouth. It's the way I talk, unfortunately.
Is that more the French influence? Or
no, my mom swore a lot, and she always would say, like, English words are so much more vulgar, and the swear words in English are like fuck. It's a very vulgar word, but in Spanish, mierda or concha tu madre, these are not as awful sounding as the English words, as vulgar. That was what she sold to me, but she swears a lot in Spanish. Spanish.
Is that formula of working and living like a monk and then going back to the wilderness or back traveling, is that still what you're operating from?
Pretty much, yeah. I've been doing it since 2006, so it's been, I guess, coming into, 15 years or so. And yeah, just living below your means and learning to invest your money wisely and trying to spend this time on the planet Earth wisely. And so that's what I've been doing, and that's what I hope to continue doing until I get bored and decide, hey, I want to do something different this time. And then I might do that. I might at some point settle, have a child or something like that, or maybe go back into the career. I like working in, high technology. I just like other things even more.
Okay. Yeah. So you're sort of in the in-between travels point right now, is that right?
That's right, yeah, because in theory I'm supposed to go travel and then write a book about it. And right now is the writing the book phase where I'm struggling so hard to do it, because the internet is very helpful for being productive in some ways, but very unhelpful, because you can go off on all sorts of rabbit holes. I wrote my second book, The Hidden Europe, so effectively because I was stuck in Croatia where I had no internet, nothing. I was in a village in the middle of nowhere. And I was so productive. I wrote that book, 750 pages in a year. Boom, banged it out. But this book about Africa, I am just struggling.
That's, I think, for anybody else who's trying to write, I've experienced this. I was just talking with my college roommate. He's under a book deadline right now, and he said, what I do mostly is I spend the first 8 hours of the day looking at coronavirus news, and then I panic write for the last 15 minutes of my workday.
Yeah, mine is I don't spend much time on coronavirus news, but yes, I do other things that I claim is productive.
It's hard if you're used to having like a free form day of an explorer and adventurer, to not just continue doing that on the internet and with ideas and things like that.
That's right.
So your most recent trip was Africa, all 54, 58 African countries?
54.
54. And over 5 years.
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about that. I know you were going to climb all the highest peaks in these countries, and that's so there's sort of like a framework, a quest, and you were driving around. But tell us a little bit about this the nature of the trip.
Yeah, so I wanted to spend 3 years in Africa, but there's so many logistical challenges getting visas, and when you have a car that wasn't very cooperative, sometimes the car would break down and require months of work on it, things like that. And also because I was just enjoying myself, I wasn't in a big hurry. So all that made it so that my 3-year trip turned out to be a 5-year trip. And yeah, I was just going overland. I never left a continent during that whole time, that whole 5-year period. I would find out what's the tallest mountain of each country and then try to go climb it. And I managed to do it for 50 out of the 54 countries.
And the other ones maybe were like in the middle of the Sahara or something, and you couldn't really get there? Or how come you didn't climb those 4?
None of them were in the middle of the Sahara. I climbed all the ones that were in, like the really, really tough ones is Emikusi, which is in the Chad, which is the tallest mountain in the entire Sahara Desert, and that's hard to get to. And I nearly lost my wife and my brother-in-law. They both nearly died on that mountain. And then the other one that was quite hard was the tallest mountain of Libya, which is on the Chad border, which is also smack in the middle of the Sahara, very isolated. But the 4 ones I did not get to do, both of them were associated with Eritrea. So Eritrea's mountain itself, as well as the tallest mountain of Djibouti, which is they share a border. On the summit of the tallest mountain of Djibouti is also a border with, if you're standing on top of the summit, you can have one foot in Ethiopia, another foot in Eritrea, and if you have a third foot, you could put it in Djibouti.
Oh, that's such a good bang for your buck there.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not the tallest mountain of all those countries. It's only the tallest mountain of Djibouti.
Okay.
So Ethiopia has its own tallest mountain, and Eritrea has its own taller mountain. But there was a couple of bang for your bucks like that. There was a couple of places in Africa where you're on the tallest mountain of 2 countries at once. So that only happened, I think, 2 or 3 times. Anyway, so Djibouti, Eritrea, Sudan, and Tunisia. Those are the 4 countries. And they're all for military reasons. They all have insurrections or problems or fighting or this kind of stuff that inhibited my ability to go there.
Okay, I definitely want to ask I definitely want to ask about your impressions of Africa, but first we got to hear the story about almost losing your wife and brother-in-law. I mean, what happened?
Yeah, it was crazy. So the tallest mountain of Chad is called Emikusi, and it's about 3,800 meters, which is, I'm going to guess something like 14,000 feet or something like that, maybe 15,000 feet. Anyway, it's a tall mountain. And it's an extinct volcano, if I remember correctly. But regardless, we went there, and we had talked to the local villagers at the bottom, and they had indicated to me that there is water up near the summit. Like, you basically, let's say 80% of your journey to the mountain there's no water, but there's somewhere along the way that you'll get water.
Okay.
So we kind of budgeted our water needs, assuming that we were going to find water on our way to the summit. And we didn't find it. And there was one point where Mustafa is my brother-in-law, and we saw like a canyon, and there was a lot of vegetation down at the bottom of the canyon, kind of green, lush vegetation, relatively lush. But it was a good walk downhill. And I told Rejoice is the name of my wife, I told her, continue walking, just take a small bottle of water with you and continue walking, and we'll meet you near the base of the summit, like before the final climb up the mountain. And I pointed out where she was supposed to go. Mm-hmm. And I thought we had communicated well where more or less we would be. And there was nobody there, and there's no vegetation. So when you yell and scream, your voice travels very far. So we should be able to figure each other out. We went down, Mustafa and I, and there was no water. Now, to make a long story longer, and we got there, and there was no Rejoice. In other words, we got to the place that we thought was more or less the meeting point. I was yelling out her name. She wasn't there. I went to the top of the mountain. She wasn't there. And so right before I went to the top of the mountain, Mustafa literally collapsed on the ground. He just, not in a kind of semi-dramatic fashion. He just said, I can't go anymore. I'm so tired. I'm so thirsty. I can't do it anymore. I'm hot. I'm whatever. And I was like, okay, I'm going to take your GPS coordinates right now. So I took out my smartphone. I pinged I bookmarked his location. I took the waypoint. And I said, stay here. Do not fucking move. I will be back here in about half an hour or so. Don't move. I go up the mountain to the summit. I come back. He's not fucking there.
Like, saw that coming.
And so I'm yelling out his name, Mustafa, Mustafa. And later on, Rejoice would tell me that she heard me calling his name. And then he heard his response to me. I didn't hear it. So she knew at that time, I guess she heard us crying for each other, and she knew that we had separated. And that's when she started to cry, because she knows that her brother has no experience in the mountains. He'd never been up in the mountains, really. And so he would be in deep shit. So I hiked back to the campsite where we had the water, the sleeping bags and stuff like that. And lo and behold, Mustafa was not there, nor was Rejoice. And it was sunset. So I put out a light beacon to blink the light to try to attract them if they walk in the night. No go. I was shivering, Derek, with not one, but 2 sleeping bags. I was wearing both sleeping bags because nobody was there. I had 3 sleeping bags. I was wearing 2 of them, and I was still cold. To give you an idea how cold, and they were at a higher altitude because they got lost higher up. Next day, finally, I find Mustafa about 2 hours of searching, and then about an hour after that, I found Rejoice. Thank God, because we were out of water, and the temperature it's shivering at night, very cold at that altitude in the desert, but it gets very hot during the day.
Yes.
And so I had to go up and down. I'd be going up and down these ravines, up and down ravines in the desert, getting baked, and I had no water. I was like, and I had to walk some 20 kilometers or more to go back and I had pressed an SOS beacon, but I know there's no way to get any rescue. There's no helicopter in sight. Nothing. So, bad situation.
Wow. Were you able to sleep? Did you?
I did. Yeah. I did sleep. I was exhausted. I was very nervous. When I was going into bed, I had an SOS beacon, so it communicates with satellite. But I knew it was fruitless. I was like, what can they do? Because Chad is as big as the east coast of the United States. They have probably just one helicopter sitting in the capital. And it's like taking an helicopter from Georgia and then flying it all the way up to New York City. It's just too far of a distance. It's not going to make it. So, and there's no airstrip. There's nothing. And even if there were, how are they going to get here in time? People are going to die of exposure in probably 24 hours or maybe 48 hours max. So I just, I was like, and I was out of water. There's only so much I could do as a searcher.
Yeah.
So at some point I would have to throw in the towel and walk back down the mountain, get more water, grab a bunch of villagers and say, hey, villagers, come up with me and help me look for maybe a dead body or something like that. Maybe somebody, sitting in a cave who's just doesn't have the strength to get out of a cave, either my wife or my brother-in-law. It was fucked up.
Did you expect that they would find their way to the bottom of the mountain in the night?
I thought maybe. Oh no! Here's a really funny story, and just shows you how little experience poor Mustafa had about the mountains. Believe it or not, he actually found water up there when he got separated from me. Yeah. He actually found the water, and guess what this fuckhead did? He drank and then left in the middle of the night to keep walking around, looking around for me. And then when the morning came, he didn't know where the water was anymore. He went back to look for it, and he's like, I had no idea where the water was. I'm like, Mustafa, when you found the water, why didn't you just stop right there in the middle of the night and just sleep next to the water, fill up your can, and then leave in the morning? And not only that, but he was afraid of animals. What animals are there in the desert? Maybe an antelope. Nobody's going to eat you. But he slept in the open, exposed to the wind and the cold, as opposed to Rejoice, who was a bit smarter and more experienced because she had gone to about 25 mountains with me. And so she knew to go in a cave of some sort, seek shelter amongst a jumble of rocks to kind of cut out the wind. But anyway, my poor brother-in-law was completely clueless. I don't blame him. He grew up in the desert. He grew up in the Sahara Desert. And so he's never seen a mountain like that in his life. And he was young. He was like 21 years old. So
what's your relationship with your brother-in-law right now?
Oh, it's great. We talk to each other every day. No, he's nobody's mad at me, but I would have been forever guilty if one or both of them had died there, because it was me who kind of had the bright idea of going to this mountain. And it's just, we got in over our heads. And ironically, not ironically, but the next week we were going to an even harder mountain, which is the tallest mountain of Libya. And that was going to be much harder in many respects. But in some ways, having undergone through that ordeal and near-death experience, we were able to do the tallest mountain of Libya without a hitch. And so it took us a week to drive there, about 3 days to hike there, with no water. We dropped water caches along the entire way. There was not a drop of water in the whole way. And we made it. We picked up the water on the way back. We GPSed each water location on the way back. We did it. But I think it's because that was such a humbling experience, and especially for Mustafa, that when I told the motherfucker, "Don't leave me," this time he listened. Don't get out of my sight. And when I tell you to stay put, you stay fucking put.
Did you change your preparation in any other way than the water caching and the better listening?
Did I change? I'm sorry, say again?
Your preparation for the Libyan mountain, did you...
we took maybe a little bit more water. I mean, I guess the key thing is we assumed there was zero water. So we took about 35 liters of water with us during that 3-day journey. And we were very diligent to put it in open spots. We could see it. We didn't hide it too tough. We GPSed every location. So we just assumed that there was not going to be a single drop of water for 3 days. And we were right. We didn't see any drop of water anywhere.
Does that also mean no villages, no people?
Nothing. Zero.
Wow.
No. Even where I parked my car, there was one dude that we saw. He was a shepherd with some goats. And I couldn't speak Arabic, and so but I indicated to him, I says, kind of like, watch my car, look at my car, stuff like that. And I gave him some money. And I didn't see him on the way back, by the way. So when we got back from the mountain, the car was still there, intact. Nothing was there. Nobody had broken into it. And we just drove away. But yeah, he was the only person we saw out there. That was next to the car. Forget about seeing anybody on the way there. But we did see evidence of like animal poop and that kind of stuff along the way. So I don't know if goat herders take their goats in this valley. There's a ravine, kind of like it's a sharp canyon, vertical walls that you kind of have to walk for the first several hours. It's very amazing, the setting there. And then from there, you have to climb out of that vertical walls ravine in a safe way. You don't have to do mountain climbing. And then that's when the adventure starts. And then after walking for 2 days, finally you get to see the mountain, and there it is. And it's another long journey just to get to the mountain. And then you get to the top. Wow. It's very few people have gone there. I've only a handful of people have ever gone in the last 1,000 years. It's very remote.
Right. So some of these mountains, I imagine, had more information about them than others, like trail maps and things. And how much information did you have for like, I don't know, how did you prepare for these mountains?
We've been blessed to be born in the 21st century, or not born in the 21st century, but to live in the 21st century, because there was another guy that I know, his name is Ginge. He attempted to climb all the 54 African mountains, and he did it in the 1990s. And back in the 1990s, there was no Google Earth. There was no NASA satellites that have gone to use lasers to map the topography of every square inch of the planet. So even though we haven't explored every square inch of the planet, or maybe made a map, a topographical map of the whole thing, now thanks to NASA, we actually have a topographical map of every square inch of the planet. That didn't exist 20 years ago. So it's make it so much easier. And of course, just the internet and other people who may have gone. So it's a lot easier to explore. We really underestimate how hard it was for the explorers of the 19th century who went to places like Lewis and Clark. They literally, it was a blank map. They had no idea where they were going to. I mean, crazy. I'm blanking out on his name, but he's a great author who wrote about Lewis and Clark. And he said, we knew more about the moon than Lewis and Clark knew about where they were going to. Because before we even set foot on the moon, we had mapped it, we had flown around it, we had taken pictures, we knew everything about where we're going to land and da-da-da-da. Lewis and Clark, they just saw a blank map. That's it. Follow this river and then find out what's after that. Who knows? People were speculating. There's a Northwest Passage. Nobody had any clues. And when the first grizzlies that they found, they were like astounded that there was a bear that they could shoot with their guns and not kill it. And it would just keep charging. And they shot it again and it would keep charging. They're like, they'd never seen anything like that, let alone seeing these redwood trees that, like these big trees, all sorts of stuff, crazy stuff. They had grown up in the prairie and they had seen the prairies. They had never seen the mountains that they see in the Cascade Mountain Range. Amazing shit.
Yeah, you may be speaking of Undaunted Courage.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Stephen Ambrose.
Yeah, that's it's quite an epic. For any good adventurer, it should be on the list.
Yeah.
So tell me about how you met your wife. So she and her brother grew up in the Sahara. Where are they from, and how'd you guys meet?
They we're not sure actually where Rejoice is born. She believes it was in Cameroon, but we don't really know. So in the northern tip of Cameroon, if you look at a map, you'll actually see there's a what's the word? When rivers meet?
A confluence.
God, I'm blanking. Confluence, yes, of several countries. There's a confluence of Chad, along with Cameroon, along with Nigeria. And they all kind of are in the same Lake Chad region.
Okay.
And that's kind of where she was born and raised. So she probably was born in Cameroon. She might have been born in Chad. She might have been born in Nigeria, but we're not sure. But she definitely spent half of her life, or the majority of her life, in Nigeria, in Borno State. And Borno State, for those who don't know, is the epicenter of Boko Haram. And she was born in 1992, and she grew up as Boko Haram was starting to rise up in power.
Is that a terrorist group? I'm not familiar.
Yeah, Boko Haram is a terrorist group of Islamic fundamentalist crazy people who, but they're based in Africa. Their headquarters is northeast Nigeria, and they have caused a lot of damage to a lot of terrorist acts. Anyway, so she grew up in the epicenter. The founder of Muhammad Yusuf, who was the founder of Boko Haram, lived not that far from Rejoice at one point when she was living in Maiduguri, which is the main capital of Borno State. Anyway, that's where they grew up, and it was a Sahara Desert. It's a very poor region, but she didn't grow up with a poor mentality in the sense that she was a princess. She was almost like royalty. She was one of the wealthier people. Of course, she didn't have running water, no electricity. She had a generator, which was kind of unusual. She had a VHS tape. She had for her standard of living, she was one of the better off ones. She was one of the wealthier ones. She always had food. She never struggled too hard, but she had a very strong disciplinarian of a mother.
Mm-hmm. And how did you meet?
So we met in an app called Badoo. And so Badoo is kind of like Tinder. And we met when I was going in Yaoundé, which is the capital of Cameroon. And I invited her to go on to a function at the Ministry of Tourism. And because I had been invited there and she would be my date. And so, yeah, it was a great thing. And by the way, Rejoice also was an orphan at the age of 14. So her mother died when she was 14. Her dad died when she was 9.
Mm-hmm. And then fast forward to she's climbing mountains all over Africa with you.
Yeah. So I took her. I basically thought, hey, let's see if this girl, what kind of mettle she has in her. What kind of drive and ability to travel. The nice thing, she comes from the Fulani tribe of Africa, and the Fulanis are a disparate tribe that kind of range across the Sahel. The Sahel is a region that cuts across the southern part of the Sahara. It goes from Senegal on the west coast all the way to Sudan, effectively. on the eastern side. And so that's the Fulani are a nomadic people. Their whole culture is around cows and moving with their cows in order to find the best places to vegetation to eat. Anyway, so I took her to Nigeria. Rejoice, I took her to the tallest mountain of Nigeria, which is called Death Mountain, which I almost died on. And then I also took her to Central African Republic, to the tallest mountain there, and to the tallest mountain of the Republic of Congo. And these romantic destinations were perfect for breaking her in and to try to see what kind of stamina she has and what kind of willingness she is to put up with discomfort. Because if she is able to do that with a smile on her face, then she's a good candidate to be my wife. And so she ended up doing that, and I was like, wow, she's a great girl. And luckily she liked me too, for some odd reason, and it worked out. And we got married actually in Zambia.
Okay. How much discomfort did you deal with going through Africa on this trip?
Discomfort is a relative thing. Everybody has their different standards. And so what's discomforting for me is different than other people. And I have a high level of tolerance for discomfort. So, but even my high tolerance, I sometimes did. One thing I think the biggest discomfort is probably something you might not think of, which is visas. Getting visas for each one of these countries is a real irritation. And so I'd say that's probably the biggest. I don't mind the mosquitoes, the malaria. I got malaria 6 times. I've been robbed, I've been strangled. But getting visas for these countries is a real, it takes away from so much of the joy of exploring Africa, because it's such a bureaucratic nightmare in many African countries. Probably about half of the countries are a pain in the ass. All the ones that everybody else has gone to, which is South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Egypt, those are Morocco. These are easy places to get visas for, and that's why they're popular, because they're easy. Nobody wants to get a visa for the Democratic Republic of Congo because it's a pain in the ass, especially if you're not applying for a visa from your home country. Things like that.
So I've never been to Africa other than Morocco, which isn't obviously any one country isn't a great representation. And my understanding as an outside observer is that Africa is just backwards in many ways, but obviously their population is growing fast. There's like Lagos is one of the world's mega cities, and my understanding is it's like the geography of Africa, right? You have this big desert, right? You don't have any great navigable rivers. There's just like some weaknesses in terms of the geopolitics of it. But so what's your sense of like how Africa is developing, where it's heading? I'd just love to get a picture from you of your impressions of Africa.
My short, simple summary is the following. Africa has been getting better overall for most Homo sapiens, most Africans, consistently, century after century, decade after decade. The general trajectory has been improving. And it will continue to do so in the next century, or this century and the next century, probably. And it will continue to lag behind the rest of the world. So that's the kind of like the disconnect that some people have, because some people say, but Africa's getting better, it's getting wealthier. It's true. But it doesn't feel that way because wealth is a relative thing. And that's the key thing. I talked about Rejoice, my wife, who felt rich, even though she didn't have running water, even though she had very little medication, even though she had to live with malaria, even though she didn't have a flushable toilet. She felt rich. Why? Because she looked around the world around her and she compared herself, and she was a lot better off than most of the people around her. And so the thing that I think has hurt Africans' self-esteem more than anything else is the media, the television, and just knowledge that some people like. Imagine how would you feel, Derek, or anybody listening to this, if there's people there if there was a part of, let's say Martians, for example, were living to be 500 years old, who had these little machines you could push a button and they, create anything. It's like the ultimate 3D printer. Basically, let's like Star Trek
replicators,
stuff. Yeah. And they're in flying machines, and they never have to work because they have robots doing all their stuff, and on, whatever. They don't have to toil at all, and they're just happy, and they get to read and create and da. And then you look at your fucking loser society in the United States of America, like you guys suck ass, right?
So
Because
the comparison, yeah.
right. So that's what it is that, and here's another way of thinking about it. A king in the Middle Ages was poorer than somebody who's below the poverty zone right now in the United States. The guy who's living below the poverty line in the United States can buy a fucking mango, can eat grapes in the wintertime. A king in the Middle Ages could never do that. He's living in, let's assume he's living in a castle in Europe. A king in the Middle Ages would never have a polio vaccine that's injected into him, who has a hope of living beyond 40 years old, who's got, let alone internet. He can walk for free into a library and just log in and talk to anybody on the planet and do all the amazing things that the internet can do. A king couldn't do that. So on and on, I can list many things that a king in the Middle Ages didn't have that somebody who's living below the poverty line in the United States has. But of course, the king felt rich and the poor person in America feels poor. Mm-hmm. Even though objectively speaking, the poor person in America is richer than the king in the Middle Ages. Do you see my point?
I think, yeah, one great lesson here is, right, it's
it's in your fucking head.
Yeah, it's in your head. If you let external circumstances dictate, then it's going to push you one direction or another. But you might as well just start feeling rich and just be rich in your mind.
Exactly. And it's easier said than done. But I think one way that helps people is reminding yourself who you compare yourself to. Donald Trump feels, I think, very frustrated that he's not in the top 10 of the Forbes 400, which is the richest people in America. So he feels like a fucking loser in many respects. Maybe he's not a good example because he doesn't think of himself as a loser. But anyway, a lot of people on the Forbes 400 probably feel like losers because there's so many people, hundreds of people above them on the list of the 400 richest people.
And so for people listening, I mean, anytime you get into comparison, it's a trap because you've been to more countries than I have. So that I could say like, oh, I'm not as good of a traveler, or you've written more books than I have, or something like that,
Right, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's a trap. It can be a trap, but it can also be a blessing. It's a wonderful way to then make yourself feel better instantly. All you got to do is just compare yourself to somebody who's less accomplished than yourself. And you can always find somebody who's done less than yourself, who's better, or who's worse than you, who's whatever. In any metric that you measure yourself by, you can always find somebody or a group of people or something that has underperformed your standard that you're measuring yourself with at that moment. And you can always find somebody who's above it. So all I'm saying is that to be happy, in my book, the Hike Your Own Hike, I even talk about this experience. Like, how would you feel you're hiking the Appalachian Trail and somebody comes in and gives you a free pizza? If you're a hiker, getting a free fucking pizza is like, wow, you have a fucking orgasm just sitting there. You're just like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. Now imagine I go into your same camping site and I not only give pizza to somebody, but I give them some brownies, and then I give them a gift certificate to the Four Seasons Hotel where they can spend 3 days at a spa to get a wash. All of a sudden you're looking at your fucking pizza and you're like, this is it? This is all I got? Come on. Right? And just nothing's changed, but in an instant you've changed your perspective and you've changed your ruler of judgment. And we all have the power in our brain, kind of what you alluded to before, Derek. We have that power in our brain to switch how and we compare ourselves, who we compare ourselves to, and what we do it. And it's very hard not to compare because that's our brains are wired that way to kind of evaluate ourselves, but just recognize that we do have a lot of control of how we evaluate ourselves. And one more on my diatribe here, one more thing. It's kind of like when the protesters on Wall Street were saying, the 1%, the 1%, the 1%, like Occupy Wall Street. I'm like, I felt like walking into the crowd and saying, you guys are the fucking 1%. Because you guys are living better than 99% of the planet out there. You just haven't gotten out of your silly little neighborhoods to realize that you are 1% of the world. Now, how would you feel like if we tax you to death and now take all that money and distribute it to the Africans and to the Southeast Asians and the other impoverished people in the world? and distribute that money because you, my dear, are part of the 1%. And they're like, wait. They suddenly back that all.
Yeah.
Oh, that 1%. Oh, no. Well, then I don't want to use that metric.
So let's go back to the middle of your journey in Africa, and are you comparing yourself as you go along? Like what perspective is this trip giving you as you go through Africa about your own life?
About my own life. Yeah, I mean, obviously you feel blessed because Africa is a wonderful place to remind yourself. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why people should and ought to visit Africa, especially the Sub-Sahara, and not just the cities. Well, I think the cities are interesting too because you can see some of the wealth that's in Africa, and you can kind of recalibrate your perception of Africa as being an impoverished shithole, because there's certainly lots of places in Africa that are actually quite wealthy. But the opposite is to remind yourself of how good you have it, and you'll come back home and you're like, oh my God, I have hot water. Chook! I have drinkable, potable water on demand. It's great. And all the blessings that we have, clean streets, no garbage on the street, and on and on and on. I can just go off and list it. So for me, my perspective, it was just it was a very good, strong reminder about how goddamn lucky I am.
Mm. I was curious, actually, when you were talking about the mountain in Libya and you said you got 34 liters of water. I'm curious about the water situation. How did you procure 34 liters and did you have to filter it? And what's the water logistics?
Yeah, so I had there's in the Sahara, believe it or not, there are oases and places where you can get water. And I had a huge jerry can, big yellow jerry can that was a big filter, and you could pump it, and it could filter thousands of liters. Now, having said that, I remember I lived for about 4 months in the capital of Niger, which is called Niamey, and there I just drank the tap water for 4 months, and I never had diarrhea or any kind of bizarre symptom. So there's a lot of places in Africa, not a lot, but there's definitely some cities in Africa where you could drink the tap water straight and be fine. But of course, there are people who in New York City, which has some of the cleanest water in the world, that people still filter their New York City water. So it's again your level of paranoia and a level of health consciousness, or whatever you want to call it. But I would use filters, and then we had a bunch of collapsible like platypuses and other things, storage containers and plastic bottles. And remember, we also were distributing the water as every kilometer or so that we would walk, we would drop off a little small water bottle, and then it was kind of like our little breadcrumbs that we would leave on the way, water crumbs, if you will. And yeah, that was great. And
more logistic questions. What vehicle were you using, and did you have any sort of special outfitting of this vehicle to drive around Africa?
I had two vehicles. So the first, I didn't have two at the same time, but the first one I bought is a Santana Anibal, which is a knockoff of the Land Rover Defender, and it turned out to be a complete lemon. Part of it is my fault. I made some mistakes driving it in certain places, but it wasn't a very reliable car. I should have gone with a Toyota, which is what I went with afterwards. I got a Toyota Hilux, which is similar to like a Toyota pickup truck. Very reliable. It was brand new when I got it. It would cost like $30,000 or something like that, but it was well worth it. Yeah. And vehicle maintenance is huge in Africa. The roads are atrocious in many places, especially if you want to go to the quote-unquote unseen Africa, to the harder, inaccessible places. I drove across the Congo, which is a mud-filled paradise. And so that's a really, really tough thing to do on your car, because you don't realize how hard Africa can be on your car. There's untold potholes and just things on the road. I remember when I was first driving into Lagos, for example, it was bumper to bumper traffic jam. It was pouring rain. So, the streets were semi-flooded, not very flooded, but you couldn't really see. The problem with semi-flooded streets is you can't see the potholes. And so then suddenly I just fell into one and I couldn't get out of it.
Oh, gosh.
my left front tire, and here I am in the middle of and so all of a sudden I stopped. I mean, there was already a traffic jam. So now all of a sudden people have to drive around me because I'm trying to back out of this pothole and try to put in reverse. And I was stuck there for about 5 minutes until I finally kicked in the auxiliary and really got myself out of that jam. But it's just, there's all sorts of hazards on the road in Africa. It's getting better. Nowadays you can drive from Cape Town to Cairo and never leave a paved road the entire time. And so they're definitely improving the infrastructure quite a bit from what it was before. I remember there's certain places I revisited in Africa. For example, when I was going between Benin and Niger, uh, the first time it was just a sandy road, just sand. I came back 4 months later, it was completely paved in 4 months. So, and you see the Chinese are helping to build a lot of the infrastructure out there, and that is also helping.
What's their stake in Africa?
The Chinese, there's a lot of conspiracy theories and a lot of people calling them neo-colonialists and that kind of stuff. In general, the African opinion of the Chinese, I found I would ask them a lot about this question, and they seem to have mixed feelings about them. Some people are very positive because they recognize the fact that the Chinese are helping to build a lot of the infrastructure out there. Some of them are saying, oh no, they're taking a lot of resources and paying very little for it. And others have just, some people are happy that they're setting, a lot of Chinese set up stores, like simple, like think of them as like a dollar store, cheap places where you can get all these Chinese imports. And that can be very valuable when you're poor. I mean, a lot of people are like anti-Chinese. I'm like, but the Chinese have helped the poorest people in many ways. They're best because they've made buying, you can buy a t-shirt for $1. And when you're making just $1 a day, that means a lot to you. That you can buy certain items, maybe matches for cheap, or a lighter for cheap, or a stove for cheap. When you're a poor person, those cheap things that are imported from China make a big difference to your life. So I think that in general, my tendency, if you asked me to summarize it succinctly, I would say that the Chinese are doing more good in Africa than ill.
Okay. And we had Jim Rogers on the show, and he drove through Africa almost 3 decades ago now, and he was looking for investments. And he told the story where he went to Botswana, I think, and he said, I bought every stock on the exchange, which was 7 companies. Where would you invest in Africa if you were going to do that?
Great question. And I have thought about that. There's no quick, easy answer. It also depends. Most of all, I guess the first thing you got to figure out is what's your risk level, your risk tolerance. Because on the one hand, a place like the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is riddled with problems, or Sudan, which has a lot of volatility right now still, is in some ways for a big risk taker a great opportunity, because you want to, there's an investor saying that says you want to invest when there's blood on the streets. So when there's blood on the streets, great time to invest. And there's lots of places in Africa, not as many as you might think, but there's lots of places in Africa where there is a proverbial blood on the streets. There's maybe not literal blood, but there's economic chaos going on. And so that presents for a savvy, a shrewd, and investor with a high risk profile a great opportunity. So, but if on the other hand, you're just looking for something safer, then there's a lot of chances of that. I would say for a lot of Westerns, people who have like a moderate risk tolerance, because obviously if you're very risk averse, you're not going to even think about Africa, because you'll probably put your shit in T-bills and stuff like that. But if you're thinking about Africa, you already have a certain level of risk tolerance. So you can start off with places that are pretty safe, like Namibia. You have Mauritius, which has been a hotbed for a lot of investment and a lot of developments. Mauritius is trying to lead the charge also with cryptocurrencies and things like that. And Ethiopia has tried to do a lot of things to try to encourage investments. So a lot of money has been pouring into Ethiopia as well. And I mean, there's several countries. I guess I could continue listing. I mean, Senegal to a certain extent. I'm trying to think of North Africa. North Africa, I mean, again, if you're looking for blood on the streets, go to Libya. I mean, because Libya, it's not going to stay in chaotic state like it is forever. And Libya has a great, nice location right on the Mediterranean Sea. It's eventually going to make a comeback. So you invest in property, you buy land, or you start up something. Eventually, Libya will come back. And it's not going to be that way, I think, forever. So anyway, there's a variety of opportunities. It all comes down to your risk level.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And
by the way, one more thing.
Sure.
For real estate, because Africa is the fastest reproducing continent. I mean, they have the highest fertility rate. Therefore, land by definition, it becomes more scarce as Homo sapiens start to encroach on themselves and on wild territories and other things. So, real estate in some ways is a nice investment, just simply because if there's one thing for sure is that real estate will become more and more scarce in Africa. So that's kind of versus a business. I have a business. I have a safari company in Tanzania. But there's more moving parts right now. For example, the Corona apocalypse has really screwed the safari business because nobody wants to travel or even can travel. So you're exposed to that. But land, if you just buy a plot of land somewhere, it's going to appreciate whatever. Even if you don't have a building on it, it's going to appreciate in value by itself. So, but you have to be super careful with Africa because there's unfortunately a lot of people who take advantage. There's very little rule of law in certain places. Property rights are not as defined. There's a lot of legal headaches to get things, especially if you're a foreigner. So it's a big can of worms. And so you have to really be adventurous in order to dip your toe into that kind of hornet's nest.
Yeah, it's probably not worth it for a lot of people. My understanding from looking at some of your podcast episodes is that you are interested in and know quite a bit about blockchain and Bitcoin. What's your interest there in those technologies?
I was born and raised in San Francisco. So, it's funny when I go to Los Angeles, I turn on the news, you always hear about the movie stars and that kind of stuff. That's like their thing. If you go to New York, you turn on the news, a lot of it's the finance world. Chicago, it's pizza. I don't know. but in Texas, it's the energy industry. So Silicon Valley, obviously, San Francisco, it's all about technology. And so when you're born and raised and, I had an Apple computer since I was little, the original Apple. Now I don't use Apple anymore. But anyway, the point is that from a very young age, I was involved in technology. And so although I'm not a pure geek, I don't know how to do programming. But I've always been more in the marketing and sales and side of things. But the bottom line is I love technology. I think it's fascinating. I think it's the differentiator. If you see why civilizations rise and fall, oftentimes technology is either a cause or an effect. So the blockchain is a up and coming technology. Well, it's been up and coming for about 10 years now. And I think in many ways it shares some of the revolutionary aspects, not as severe, but in a similar way as the internet itself. So I remember I was getting my first email in 1992 or something like that, or 1990, 1991. And I remember in 1992, I got the Mosaic browser. That was Mark Andreessen when he was in the Midwest. He had invented the browser. And I remember surfing on the web at that early stage. And in some ways, I feel like blockchain is in a similar sense in that, especially things like Bitcoin. We may be at those early stages, and that we'll look back at this time period as kind of like the infant stage of cryptocurrencies and that kind of stuff. But at the same time, I don't want to be hyperbolic about it because some people say it's just like the internet. I'm like, no, I don't think it's that revolutionary as the entire internet. I think it's a interesting technology that will have important ramifications, but not maybe that revolutionary.
Okay. And so you mentioned you have a tour company in Tanzania. Yeah. And were you working at all while you traveled? Did you just live off of savings through that whole 5 years?
Yeah, I lived off savings the whole time. Yeah, I basically saved up money. I invested it. Luckily, usually wisely, sometimes not so wisely. But as a result, I had enough savings. And I also travel very simply, super frugally. And so I think that's a lot of times people make that disconnect when they think of travelers who are nomadic and they're traveling for many years. They think, oh my God, you guys must be a trust fund baby or something like that. It really doesn't take that much money. The whole trip for 5 years in Africa probably cost me about $110,000, which is of course a lot of money, no question about it. But when you think about how much people plunk down to buy a Tesla, they can buy $100,000 Tesla, or if you don't want to travel for 5 years, you just want to travel for 1 year, you can do it for less than 20 grand. And a lot of people, if you do have a little bit of diligence and a little bit of frugality, you can, especially in high income countries like most of us live in, right, who's listening to this podcast, you can do it. It's very hard for an African to save up $10,000, but an American or a Swiss or a Norwegian, it's really easy to do that. Really easy. Even if you're only making 30 grand a year. I know it because I've seen other people do it and I've done it myself.
And what were some of the trade-offs? Like what would be, if you were going to travel a little bit more expensively, like what would be the first difference you would change?
I might camp less often occasionally. I mean, I like camping. I really enjoy it. But, sometimes You miss a proper shower. I would always have like a 2 liter bottle of water I could pour over my head, and it's quite refreshing actually. So I'd use half a liter or something like that to kind of soap yourself up, and then the rest 1.5 liters to like pour yourself down. And it actually works, and you actually feel quite refreshed just doing that. But after a while, it'd be nice maybe to stay a little bit more times in hotels, maybe eat out a little bit more often at maybe fancier restaurants. I guess I would take random things up a notch here and there. But sometimes I couch surf, and maybe I don't feel like couch surfing because I don't feel like socializing with the host. I just want to like zone out, or I need to geek out on my computer. I need to write. I got to take notes, and I just feel rude going into somebody's house and saying, "Hi, nice to meet you." And I'm going to go slam myself in the room and just type on my computer by myself, and that's kind of rude. Mm-hmm. So things like that I would probably splurge on occasionally.
Yeah. And you have a Harvard MBA, and I know that you perhaps maybe more in your Eastern European trip, but you were sort of looking for like, what are they doing economically or business wise? Like what are people in Africa doing well, that ideas that we could import to the United States?
Yeah. So are you asking about Eastern Europe or Africa?
Starting with Africa, but I know that was like the intent of the Eastern Europe trip, if I'm correct.
Yeah, the book is called The Hidden Europe: What Eastern Europeans Can Teach Us. And I felt that every culture has something to teach us. Mm-hmm. Every place on the planet has something you can learn. It doesn't necessarily mean maybe necessarily a best place to invest, that kind of stuff, but some maybe best practices and things like that. Now, often, though, it's this thing about trade-offs. So you can look at Africans and say, for example, Africans are super good at forgiving. I don't think any continent is better than Africa to find a group of people who tend to forgive easily and often. But that's a double-edged sword, because when societies forgive a lot and easily, then that can encourage, in a perverse way, more criminality or more laziness or thievery or that kind of stuff. Because when you're not punished for your crimes, if somebody says, "Oh, no, I forgive you, it's okay," then you're like, "Okay, I'll just do that again," And so, unfortunately, another thing about Africa that you often see, there's a strong community spirit. So nobody's ever going to be left to starve. I mean, we have images of starving Africans, but that's a really, really, really rare thing to see. In general, Africans have enough food, and there's a feeling of trying to share in the community. You got to help, especially the family, and the family is fairly broadly defined. It has a fairly extended family, but the challenge is that you have this family structure where you're kind of looking out after. There's a safety net built in there. But what does that do? That's the nice thing about it, right? So that you feel like there's this kind of, they have their 401k plan. Everybody has their kind of protection there. But on the other hand, that can encourage laziness and slothfulness. Why? Because why do I need to really work? Because my uncle is going to help feed me if I don't need to. My aunt is going to help house me, So that's a double-edged sword. So everything is, like, for example, a strength of the Eastern Europeans is they're very blunt and honest people. But that can be perceived as rude. That's the flip side of it, right? So that's what I mean. There's a lot of double-edged things. So I'm not, my mom was from Chile. I remember that when I went to Santiago, I talked to my cousin, and he said, I asked him how things had changed over the last 30 years. And he said, I came into a meeting and they said, "Hey, you're 3 minutes late." And that would have never happened many years ago. But that's because the culture has changed. And now all of a sudden they're valued timeliness and time is money and that kind of stuff. And there's some benefits to thinking of time as money, because your society becomes efficient and society becomes wealthier in many measures. But the downside of that is that people can become more difficult or less patient, that kind of stuff.
Gosh, you're reminding me of Portugal with I guess time is so different everywhere, but Portugal is probably the worst in terms of like they might not actually show up at all. They might be an hour late. Half an hour late is on time, and it's so frustrating if you're a busy person and you actually have stuff to do.
Don't go to sub-Saharan Africa. You'll find they take that to a new level. They look like they make the Portuguese look like Swiss or Germans.
Okay. Can you compare? We haven't talked at all about the Eastern Europe trip, but can you just sort of like compare, um, perhaps the differences between these two sort of big trips? Because it was what, 3 years in Eastern Europe,
Yeah, 3.5. Yeah.
3.5 years. So two big chunks of your life. Can you compare the trips, and can you also compare like like where you were between these two?
Yeah. Okay, so Eastern Europe is obviously very similar to Western Europe in many respects. Wonderful infrastructure, transportation. They even have a tourist infrastructure in most places in Eastern Europe. So there's hostels and things like that you can go to. There's tours. There's good maps. A lot of African countries you go to, they don't even have a map. You go to the tourist office. They don't have the wealth sometimes to like hand you, here's a map of the area or the tourist sites or that kind of stuff. They don't, because printing maps cost money, and they just don't have that much money in many places. And they just don't have the infrastructure. But you can get around in Africa. It's just there won't be any bus timetable, and even if there's no such thing as a bus timetable in most of Africa, because most buses, they leave when they're full. So basically, you go to the bus stop, and the bus piles on, and just
You want to be the like second to last person on the bus, essentially.
Right, exactly. Unless you're picky about your seat, then you want to maybe be a bit earlier. But if you're not picky about your seat, you're right. You want to be one of the last people on the bus. So those are some of the big differences between the two. As far as me changing, I would say that in Eastern Europe, I was single the entire time for 3.5 years. In Africa, I spent half the time single, and the other half of the time I was married with Rejoice, traveling with her. And that was interesting in itself, because in the Eastern Europe trip, I was solo the entire time. In Africa, I was solo half the time. But with traveling with not just a woman, not just my wife, but also a Black African. Wow. That was very interesting, because that just opened up a whole nother dimension, things that I just completely missed out on, because she's not just a woman. Because if I had gone with a white woman, that would have changed things, of course, but nowhere, because I did actually travel bits and pieces with white women of Africa. I'm not of Africa, but who visited me. A couple of times I had people, but it's a whole different ballgame when you're with a Black African. It just changes the dynamics dramatically.
My expectation is that perhaps you would be more quickly accepted, quicker to make friendships. Is that?
Yeah, that's certainly one thing. One benefit is that people will suddenly not see you in general. I mean, they're like, oh, that's your wife. Oh, great. Oh, wonderful. That now all of a sudden, because I think sometimes they look at foreigners and they're like, okay, what does this foreigner want from me? Is he against me? Is he look down on me? Does he think Black people are lame? That kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden when they say, oh, you're kind of part of the tribe, even though, Rejoice is from Cameroon. And if you're sitting in Botswana, it's like you've got nothing to do with Botswana in many respects. But there's a certain brotherhood and sisterhood that exists in Africa. Like, hey, you're on our continent. You're Black like us. I always think it's kind of probably interesting and fascinating and difficult maybe for African Americans from the United States to go to Africa, because they're kind of like, they physically kind of look similar, but obviously culturally they're miles apart. Versus Rejoice is African, and she shares a lot of she knows the values of a lot of the continent. Because, by the way, there's a lot of commonality throughout the continent. Mm-hmm. And Rejoice and I, that's something that she and I agree on. We were always surprised and stunned by how much things did not change dramatically as we expected. It's an expectation game. But yeah, it was fascinating. And so that was one of the big benefits. I also saw like how much power, white privilege I might have as a guy with a passport from the United States versus her with a Cameroonian passport. She couldn't get into many countries without my strong assistance, and that was tough to see. She couldn't get a visa for many places if it wasn't for me kind of pounding on the table saying, no, she's my fucking wife, give me the goddamn visa for her, and they would eventually cough it up.
I feel like I don't necessarily want to rant about borders, but I've heard from so many people about this, and you mentioned this earlier, just the annoyance of visas, borders, and people exercising some border guard saying like, I'm going to use my power and like make someone have a hard time. It seems like such a antiquated need for this thing, given viruses cross borders whenever they want.
That's right. Yeah. No, it's but the good news, I suppose, Derek, is that borders have been softening up over time. In other words, if you look at certainly, I mean, maybe the whole European Union will implode after this coronavirus, but in general, borders it's never been easier to travel as far as how efficient border crossings are. Africa is even getting better. There's a lot of countries, even when I started, that by the time I ended had relaxed some of their policies. For example, Angola, for example, it was very difficult for me to get anything. I got a 5-day transit visa to transit Angola. Angola is an enormous country, huge, and it takes you a couple of days just to drive across it nonstop. So they gave me a 5-day transit visa. Nowadays, they give most high-income countries or Westerners a visa on arrival. And that's changed. And Nigeria had a very toxic and difficult visa process, and they're kind of revisiting that. And here's the best news for Africans themselves, is that there's certain countries that are really trying to make it easier for Africans. I explained to you how Rejoice was having trouble visiting other African countries. Well, now a lot of African countries are making it easier for Africans themselves to visit each other. So that makes a huge, huge difference. I think I could be wrong about this, but I think about 14% of the visitors in Africa, the tourists, are Africans themselves. 14% of African tourists are other Africans visiting. So majority of tourists in Africa are not from Africa, which is completely perverse. You know, it's kind of like, imagine if the same thing were true if you're in Hungary, in Europe, and you're like, or Czechia, and like, what the hell, really? Anyway, so that's, for example, Rwanda, for example, I think Seychelles. These are two countries that are allowing any African to come in, visa on arrival, instantly from all 54 African countries. So there's motion. And last thing is they're creating a kind of like a European Union of sorts. It's an African common market that they are hoping to implement this decade in the 2020s that will help remove a lot of the borders and restrictions and allow for free commerce. And that will be very helpful. Of course, yeah. So I guess, we can mope and drag our feet and cry about how difficult things are, and they are, but they are getting better. That's the good news.
Just one quick question about Rejoice's experience of American culture. When she came to the States with you for the first time, what did you learn from her about being American?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, she's a clean freak herself, and Africa is not a very clean place oftentimes. There's a lot of trash. So she was just, so thrilled that everywhere the streets are so clean. Like she's like, I can practically eat off of the floor here, eat off the concrete. It's so immaculate compared to much of Africa. The only place that are really clean in Africa is the Sahara Desert, where there's nobody there. But even in the Sahara Desert, you'll see like a tumbleweed of plastic, like all of a sudden, like, bloop, there goes a plastic bottle that flies by. But yeah, so that's one thing. The other thing that was, I suppose, more cultural is that she's just astounded by how workaholic we all are in America, how incredibly fucking productive we are. She just, and it's kind of infectious. So she feels like she's been infected by this bug of just productivity. So she nowadays, she multitasks. She tries to do many things and she almost laments that she spent so much time in Africa doing fucking nothing. She would just sit there and play video games all day long, watch videos or chat with her friends or stare at a wall or sleep for 12 hours. Just being things that nowadays she looks at and it's like, my God, I was unproductive. I could have been reading biology books. I could have been, because she wants to be a nurse. I could have been doing so many more quote unquote useful things with my time. And, in America, I told her, I said, don't worry about money, because in America you can always make money. And she didn't believe it, but now she believes it, because, in the middle of the coronavirus, she was offered a babysitting job to make $30 an hour. Here, she doesn't have a fucking high school diploma. She doesn't have, and she just got her GED. She studied a year to get it, and she got her GED. But she's like, I came here, and she started working at Safeway and making $15 an hour. Working for Instacart.
Yes. And
she came with no diploma and making $15 an hour. And she's like, my God, how does anybody suffer in this country? How does anybody complain? I'm like, I come here with jack shit, nothing, no education. I speak with an accent, that kind of stuff. And people are complaining about America, how hard it is to live here. Goodness, you can just get a job anywhere if you want, if you really need to. And she was finding jobs in the middle of the coronavirus. It's just like, come on. And so in that sense, that was very eye-opening for her. Versus, you can have a fucking PhD in Cameroon, and you will not find a fucking job. You might be ending up washing dishes, because if you don't have connections, if you don't have the right people, it's tough to find a job. But you can be a dumb shit in Africa, no diploma, but because your uncle works at some factory or is whatever, you get that job. Now, a lot of people will say, well, that same thing happens in America. Yes, but nowhere near the level it does in Africa.
This is, gosh, I mean, I feel like there's so much richness. I mean, we get, right, you've got decades of travel that we're talking about here, but so let's wrap it up. I don't know if there's a final thought you'd like to touch on, anything that you want to mention that we haven't so far. I'll leave it to you for that.
Yeah, I'm just working on my book. I have a Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/ftapon, you'll be able to become one of my patrons. And the lowest reward is $2 a month. And for $2 a month, I send you copies of my book as I'm writing them. And you can critique it and read it about the unseen Africa. So it's about the 54 countries that I visited, one chapter per country. So I'm pumping out that. And my next big journey, a lot of people ask me, what am I going to be doing next? It's going to be going to the Middle East and Central Asia. So all the stans and all the Gulf states and that kind of stuff, and spend several, 6 to 12 months there, I imagine, visiting all those countries, because I think they're also another misunderstood region. And ultimately, after that, go to East Asia, and then I want to get a boat and travel around the Pacific, assuming I live that long. So we'll see how it goes.
Right.
That's the thing. You never know when your time is up.
That's true. So you're working on this book. You've got 2 books. I think we mentioned them both. Those are on Amazon. You've got your podcast, the Wander Learn podcast, of which
right.
I'll be appearing on. It was on your show yesterday. We did an interview.
And by the way, tease people about what your
this is probably
we were both taken as surprised by it.
I know we talked quite a lot about extraterrestrials and various far out there things. So it'll be fascinating whether you believe in it or not.
Oh, one thing that I did not mention on that podcast, and I thought about it after we hung up, was that I suspect possibly that string theory could explain our universe, our subatomic universe, quite well, and explain everything, and join together the quantum physics with quantum gravity, and bring the quantum world and gravity together, general relativity and the quantum theory together, and string theory could in fact do it. And string theory posits that there are multiple dimensions. So there's 4 dimensions that we know about, and then there's the rest, maybe 6, 7 different other dimensions, are curled up in tiny little micro dimensions that we can't even perceive because we don't have the instruments and the technology to perceive them. And so it's quite possible that we live in a dimension. We have 10 dimensions, maybe 11 dimensions in this planet, and we've only figured out 4 of them so far. And so that's where, when you and I were talking about, let's say, angels and other kind of phenomena that are hard to explain, that I think leads to potential answers, that where the 2 fields could marry each other. String theory and its all its extra dimensions could join up with the people who have been talking for a long time that there's all sorts of unexplained phenomena, UFOs and all sorts of stuff, that maybe there's a link there. Maybe not. So that's why I keep my mind open to it, even though you and I disagree fundamentally on many things. But that's what that podcast I thought was such an interesting conversation, because we go at it. But I just want to mention this string theory issue as yet another point in your favor, if you will, another side that I would say this is an area where I think you and I can kind of agree on that this is a promising area of research that could explain some of this phenomena.
So for everybody listening, now you're probably super curious, like what the heck were they talking about? So go listen to our episode over on his podcast. And thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Derek. It's an honor to be here.